I pulled into my driveway expecting quiet. 2 weeks on the road will do that to you. You just want silence, familiar shadows, the feeling that nothing changed while you were gone. I remember rolling to a stop, the headlights sweeping across the front of the house, and my brain not registering what I was seeing at first. Something was wrong. Not that's odd wrong, the kind of wrong that makes your stomach tighten before your mind catches up. My driveway looked distorted, like a scene where the pieces don't fit together. Then it clicked. My Lamborghini, or what was left of it. The front end was crushed inward like it had been folded by hand. Carbon fiber shattered across the concrete. The hood was buckled, the wheel pushed at an angle no wheel should ever be. Fluids glistened under the porch light, slowly crawling toward the street. The bright orange paint, something I could spot from a block away on a normal day, was scraped, gouged, smeared with dark streaks that didn't belong there. I just sat there gripping the steering wheel of my rental car, not breathing, not moving, waiting for my eyes to tell me this was a mistake, that maybe I'd parked somewhere else, that maybe this was a bad joke. But the house was mine, the driveway was mine, and the wrecked Lamborghini was very much mine too. 2 weeks earlier I had parked it right there, perfectly straight, engine cooled, tires clean, no warning lights, no issues. I remember locking it, giving it that last glance everyone gives their car before walking away. Now it looked like it had been through a demolition derby. My first thought wasn't anger, it was confusion. Who hits a parked car in a private driveway? I stepped out slowly, the way you do when your brain is still buffering. The air smelled wrong, burnt rubber and coolant. I crouched near the front bumper and felt the crunch of carbon fiber under my shoe. The damage wasn't light. This wasn't someone clipping it while backing out. This was impact, force, commitment. I stood back up and scanned the street. No skid marks leading away, no debris trail like someone panicked and fled. Whoever did this hadn't rushed, they hadn't swerved, they had lined up and driven straight into it. Twice, as I would later learn. That's when the cost hit me. Not just the emotional punch, but the cold math. This wasn't a fender bender. This wasn't a buff-it-out situation. A Lamborghini Huracan isn't built like a Camry. One hard hit to the wrong structural points and you're talking total loss. Frame damage, 6 figures gone in seconds. I felt my jaw tighten, not because of the money, insurance exists, but because of what it meant. Someone had crossed a line you don't cross. This wasn't negligence. This was intentional. I walked around the car slowly, taking it in from every angle, my mind already shifting gears. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't shouting. Years of dealing with fraud cases teaches you one thing early: emotion comes later. Evidence comes first. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The damage, the angle of impact, the way the tire was pushed inward, the height of the crush, which already told me something important. Whatever hit it sat higher than a normal sedan. An SUV, maybe. A truck. As I straightened up, my eyes drifted toward the corner of the house, toward the small black dome mounted under the eave. One of several security cameras I'd installed months earlier, more out of habit than fear. Cloud-backed, motion-triggered, wide angle. I felt a strange flicker of calm. If someone did this, they did it on camera. Inside the house, my bag sat untouched by the door as I pulled up the footage on my tablet. My hands were steady. That surprises people when I tell this part. They expect shaking, rage, disbelief. But what I felt was focus, the same feeling I get when a case finally stops being theoretical and starts being real. I scrubbed back through the timeline. Midnight. Nothing. 1 a.m., a cat darting across the driveway. 2 a.m., headlights briefly flashing down the street, no motion trigger. Then, just after 3, there it was. The screen filled with the unmistakable bulk of a large SUV easing into frame, a Suburban, dark color, familiar shape. It rolled slowly at first, almost cautiously, stopping just short of the Lamborghini. I leaned closer. The driver didn't get out, didn't hesitate. The brake lights flickered, then went off. The SUV lurched forward and slammed directly into the Lamborghini's front end. I actually whispered, "What the hell?" to an empty room. The impact rocked the car backward a few inches. The Suburban reversed, tires crunching debris, backed up several feet. For a split second, I thought maybe they were panicking. Maybe they'd misjudged something horribly. Then the SUV accelerated forward again. The second hit was harder, more deliberate. When the Suburban finally stopped, the driver's door opened. A woman stepped out, adjusted her jacket, and looked straight toward the camera. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look scared. She smiled, not a nervous smile, not an oh-no smile, a satisfied one. She stood there for a moment, hands on her hips, surveying the damage she'd just caused. Then she got back into the SUV and drove away at a completely normal speed, as if she'd just finished backing out of a grocery store parking spot. I froze the frame. There was no doubt about who it was. I knew her face. Everyone in the neighborhood did. The HOA president. At that moment, my brain still tried to soften it. I told myself there had to be an explanation, a medical emergency, a brake failure. Something. People don't just ram their neighbor's car on purpose, especially not someone with a position, a reputation, a spotless public image built on community standards and neighborhood values. I replayed it again and again. The angle, the pause, the second hit, the look at the camera. This wasn't an accident. At this point, I still thought it was an accident. I was wrong. I sat back in the chair, the room quiet except for the faint hum of the fridge, and let the weight of it settle in. Not just that my car was destroyed, but that the person who did it hadn't even tried to hide. She hadn't worn a hood. She hadn't covered her plates. She hadn't avoided the camera. She'd wanted me to see it. That realization changed everything. This wasn't about property damage. This was a message, a flex, a statement that said, I can do this, and you won't stop me. I closed the footage and looked back out the front window at the wrecked Lamborghini sitting under the porch light like a crime scene waiting to be processed. Somewhere between disbelief and clarity, one thought settled in with absolute certainty. Whoever did this had no idea who they'd just messed with. And that's where this story really begins. I replayed the footage one more time, slower this time, frame by frame, forcing myself to stay clinical. Not because I wasn't angry, I was, but because anger makes people sloppy, and whoever was on that screen hadn't been sloppy at all. She'd been deliberate. The Suburban eased into view like it belonged there. No headlights flashing wildly, no sudden movements. The way it rolled to a stop told me the driver knew exactly how much space she had. She wasn't confused, she wasn't lost, she wasn't startled by seeing a bright orange Lamborghini where she didn't expect one. She parked herself, paused, and made a decision. Then she drove straight into it. When I froze the frame, at the moment of impact, the damage made sense in a way it hadn't when I first saw the wreckage outside. The height of the bumper, the angle of the hood collapsing, the way the Lamborghini shifted backward instead of sideways. This wasn't a glancing blow. It was a head-on hit delivered at low speed but with full intent. The kind of hit you make when you're not trying to escape. Quickly, you're trying to make a point. The second hit erased any doubt. After reversing, she didn't hesitate. There was no moment of indecision, no hand-to-mouth shock. She lined it up again and pressed the accelerator, harder this time. The Lamborghini jolted, carbon fiber splintering like dry wood. The Suburban's suspension barely dipped. It was built for this kind of force. Then she stepped out. That was the moment that locked everything into place for me, because people who make mistakes behave one way, and people who feel entitled behave another. She adjusted her jacket like she'd just finished a task on a to-do list. She surveyed the damage the way someone inspects a freshly mowed lawn, and then she looked straight at the camera. Not through it, at it. The camera was small, discreet, mounted high enough that most people never noticed it unless they were looking for it. She noticed it immediately, which meant she'd either seen it before or she didn't care. The smile wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exaggerated. That's what made it unsettling. It was calm, self-assured, the kind of expression someone wears when they believe the rules don't apply to them. I zoomed in. There was no mistaking her. Constance Whitmore, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, 8 years in the role, re-elected every time, known for her newsletters about maintaining neighborhood harmony and protecting property values. The same woman who chaired meetings with a gavel and a smile, who spoke slowly and clearly about bylaws and compliance, as if she were reading from a script written just for her. And here she was, on my screen, totaling my car. I leaned back and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The room felt smaller all of a sudden, like the walls had moved in a few inches. Not because I was afraid, but because the situation had shifted from random to personal. Random damage is a problem. Personal damage is a conflict. I thought back over the last few months. The comments, the looks, the way she'd stopped me once during a walk and asked with forced politeness whether the vehicle situation in my driveway was permanent. At the time, I'd taken it for what it sounded like. Mild disapproval wrapped in HOA language. Now it replayed differently. I scrubbed back again and watched the moment she stepped out of the Suburban. Her posture was relaxed, shoulders back. No rush. She took in the damage like she was admiring work well done. When she smiled, it wasn't just confidence, it was familiarity. As if she'd done something like this before and knew exactly how it would play out. That thought lodged itself in my mind and refused to leave. I pulled up another camera angle. This one from across the street. The Suburban entered the neighborhood at a normal speed, no erratic driving, no signs of impairment. She drove like someone completely in control of her actions. When she left, she didn't peel out. She didn't hesitate at the stop sign. She followed the rules perfectly. That detail mattered. People who panic make mistakes. They speed, they swerve, they leave evidence. Constance did none of that. She acted like someone who expected no consequences. I saved the footage in multiple locations. Cloud, local drive, encrypted backup. Time-stamped, untouched. If this ever went in front of an insurance adjuster, a lawyer, or a judge, it would speak for itself. Then I just sat there, staring at the paused image of her face on my screen. I tried, honestly, to give her the benefit of the doubt. To imagine a version of events where this was some bizarre misunderstanding. Maybe she thought the driveway was blocked. Maybe she thought the car didn't belong there. Maybe she believed, somehow, that she had the authority to resolve the situation herself. But the more I replayed it, the less plausible that became. This wasn't someone enforcing a rule, this was someone acting out a belief that she was allowed to decide what belonged in the neighborhood and what didn't. And that if something offended her sense of order, she could remove it. I thought about calling the police immediately, about walking next door and confronting her, about doing what most people would do in that moment. And then I didn't, because I'd seen this pattern before, not with cars, not with HOAs, but with people who abuse systems. They rely on outrage, they rely on emotional reactions, they rely on you making the first move without understanding the full scope of what you're dealing with. So instead, I started asking a different question. Not why did she do this, but how long has she been doing things like this? I pulled up the HOA newsletters archived on the community website, skimmed through the last year, then 2 years, then further back. The language was always the same, pleasant, measured, heavy on words like standards and aesthetics and community expectations. But once I started reading with fresh eyes, patterns emerged. Certain rules were emphasized repeatedly, certain violations came up. Again and again. Vehicles, colors, noise, visibility, things that stood out, things that were different. I thought about the neighbors who'd moved out quietly, the houses that sold quickly, sometimes at a loss, the conversations I'd overheard but never paid much attention to. At the time, I'd chalked it up to normal turnover. Now, with Constance's smile frozen on my screen, it felt like I'd been missing something obvious. I didn't know it yet, not fully, but this wasn't the first time she'd decided something didn't belong. And it wasn't the first time she'd taken matters into her own hands, one way or another. The footage wasn't just evidence of a crime, it was a window into a mindset. I closed the laptop and looked back outside. The Lamborghini sat exactly where she'd left it, broken and silent. Tomorrow, insurance adjusters would come. Reports would be filed. Official processes would start moving. But tonight, something else had started too. Because the moment I recognized her on that screen, the story stopped being about a damaged car and started being about power. About what happens when someone gets used to controlling a community and forgets that the rules they hide behind don't protect them forever. What I didn't know yet was that this wasn't the first time she'd done something like this. And it definitely wouldn't be the last time her name showed up where it didn't belong. People see a Lamborghini and they fill in the blanks themselves. They see money, ego, flash. They assume it's about showing off. That assumption is easy, and it's wrong. Standing there that night, looking at the wreck in my driveway, I realized something very clearly. The car had never been the point. It was a symbol, and symbols make people react in ways facts never do. I didn't grow up around cars like that. I didn't grow up around money at all. I grew up in Detroit, in a house where the walls were thin and the winters were long. My mom worked double shifts at Ford, sometimes nights, sometimes weekends, whatever they needed. When she came home, she smelled like oil and metal and exhaustion. I learned early what work actually looked like. Not the kind people talk about online, but the kind that wears your body down piece by piece. When she got sick, everything narrowed. Cancer has a way of doing that. The world becomes appointments, bills, waiting rooms, and numbers you don't want to look at too closely. I burned through my savings without thinking twice. Every dollar I had went to treatments, prescriptions, time off work. There was never a question of whether it was worth it. It just was. Somewhere in the middle of all that, I started building something, a cybersecurity business. Out of her basement, old desk, second-hand equipment, coffee that tasted like cardboard. I wasn't chasing luxury. I was chasing stability, control. A way out of always being one bad month away from disaster. Years passed. The company grew. Slowly at first, then faster. I learned how to read people, how to spot patterns, how to follow money when it didn't want to be followed. I built a reputation on doing the unglamorous work, digging, documenting, waiting. Eventually that work paid off. The Lamborghini came much later. I didn't buy it the first time I could afford it. Or the second. I waited, partly because it felt irresponsible and partly because it felt unreal. When I finally did it, it wasn't impulsive, it was quiet, intentional. I remember signing the paperwork and feeling calm, not excited in the way people expect, but settled, like closing a chapter. To me, that car represented survival, proof that the sacrifices had amounted to something, proof that the nights in that basement, the stress, the fear of losing everything, hadn't been for nothing. When my mom saw it for the first time, she laughed, not because of the car itself, but because she understood what it meant. "That's yours?" she asked, smiling like she already knew the answer. Yeah, it was mine. So when Constance drove into it, twice, it didn't feel like she'd damaged a vehicle. It felt like she'd reached into a story she had no part in and decided to erase a chapter she didn't like, as if my presence, my success, my choices offended her sense of how the neighborhood was supposed to look. That's what hurt, not the money. Insurance would handle that. What hurt was the assumption behind her actions, the belief that she could take something away simply because it didn't fit her idea of appropriate. Standing there, I realized she hadn't seen a car. She'd seen a reminder that someone like me existed in a place she thought she controlled, someone who didn't ask permission, someone who didn't match the image she curated so carefully in HOA newsletters and meetings. And she'd reacted the only way people like that know how, by trying to remove it. I thought about how easily this could have gone differently. If I'd been younger, if I'd been less experienced, if I'd panicked, how many people would have just accepted it as bad luck, filed a claim, and quietly adjusted their behavior? Or to avoid future issues, park somewhere else, buy something less noticeable, blend in. That's what she expected. That's why the smile on the camera bothered me so much. It wasn't just satisfaction, it was confidence born of repetition, confidence that this move would work the way it always had. I walked back inside and sat at the kitchen table. The footage paused on my tablet, the house silent, and for the first time since I'd pulled into the driveway, I let myself feel it fully. The anger, the disbelief, the clarity. This wasn't about a car anymore. It was about what she thought she could take from me. Because if she could do this, if she felt entitled to destroy something that didn't belong to her, on property that wasn't hers, then this wasn't just a personal conflict. It was a pattern, a test. And if I backed down, she'd learn exactly what she wanted to learn. That intimidation worked. I thought about my mom again, about everything she'd endured without ever thinking she was owed anything, about how hard she'd worked so I could have options. And I thought about how easily someone like Constance dismissed that kind of effort because it didn't come wrapped in the right packaging. I wasn't angry because I'd lost something expensive. I was angry because she'd decided, without knowing me, without understanding anything about my life, that I didn't belong. That realization hardened into resolve. I knew then that I wasn't going to let this end quietly, not because I needed revenge, but because allowing it would mean agreeing with her premise. That people like her get to decide who fits and who doesn't, who stays and who leaves. I'd spent my career dismantling that exact kind of thinking in boardrooms and courtrooms, watching powerful people assume no one would ever challenge them. Constance had no idea that by totaling my car, she'd done the one thing she shouldn't have done. She'd turned a symbol into a line, and once a line like that is crossed, there's no going back to pretending it was just about aesthetics or rules or neighborhood harmony. It becomes about principle, about whether intimidation wins by default. As I shut down the tablet and turned off the lights, one thought stayed with me, steady and unshakable. If she believed she could take this from me without consequence, she was about to learn how wrong that belief really was. The first official notice arrived 3 days after the crash. Not a phone call, not a knock on the door. A neatly folded letter slipped into my mailbox like it had always belonged there. White envelope, HOA letterhead, Constance's name printed at the bottom in clean, confident type. Notice of violation. I remember standing in the kitchen, envelope in one hand, coffee going cold in the other, already knowing this wasn't about the accident. It couldn't be. The insurance process was moving, the police report had been filed, and Constance hadn't reached out once. Not to apologize, not to explain, not even to pretend it had been a mistake. This letter wasn't about damage. It was about control. The notice cited a bylaw number I didn't recognize. Buried halfway down the page was the phrase, vehicle aesthetic compliance. According to the letter, my Lamborghini, what was left of it, violated newly clarified community standards regarding subdued, tasteful vehicle colors visible from the S. Treat. Newly clarified. That phrase stuck with me. I pulled up the HOA bylaws online and started searching, page after page of regulations about fences, lawn height, trash bins. Then I found it. Bylaw 47 degrees Celsius, added 6 months earlier, approved unanimously by the board, announced in a single paragraph of a monthly newsletter most people skimmed, if they read it at all. Vehicles parked on visible property must conform to subdued, non-disruptive color palettes in keeping with neighborhood aesthetics. It was vague on purpose. Words like tasteful and disruptive are elastic. They stretch to fit whoever's pulling on them. At the bottom of the notice was a fine schedule, $500 per day. Beginning immediately, I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so transparent. My car had already been destroyed. It wasn't going anywhere. And yet here was the HOA, suddenly very concerned about its color. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I waited. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This one labeled Final Warning. Same bylaw, same language. This time, the fine total was calculated, a running tab, like a meter ticking upward. That afternoon, I got an email notifying me of an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for the following evening. No agenda listed, no explanation beyond urgent community concern. I checked the state HOA statutes. Emergency meetings required specific conditions, immediate threats, safety issues, natural disasters, not personal grievances. Still, I went. The meeting was held in the community center, a room I'd only ever seen half full for holiday potlucks. That night, the board sat at a folding table up front. "Constance," In the center, calm, composed, a stack of papers in front of her like props waiting for their cue. She opened the meeting with practiced warmth, thanked everyone for coming on short notice, spoke about recent developments and the importance of maintaining the integrity of the community. Then she turned to me. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She read from the bylaws, carefully, slowly, like a teacher explaining rules to a student who should know better. She referenced complaints, anonymous of course, about visual disruption, about discomfort, about declining property values. Photos were passed around, pictures of my driveway taken at angles designed to make the damage look obstructive, exaggerated, intrusive. One photo even showed a sidewalk partially blocked, though I recognized the angle immediately. The sidewalk wasn't blocked. The photographer had stepped into the street to make it look that way. When it came time to vote, there was no discussion, no debate. The fine was approved unanimously, $500 per day. I raised my hand. Constance smiled thinly and acknowledged me. I asked about notice requirements, about emergency criteria, about why a bylaw added quietly months ago was suddenly urgent now. I quoted the statute, calmly, precisely. For the first time that evening, her expression flickered. She dismissed my concerns as procedural misunderstandings, said the board had full discretion, moved on. The meeting ended quickly after that. Over the next week, the pattern intensified. Another violation notice, this time for excessive engine noise, despite the fact that the car hadn't run since the crash. A neighbor mentioned, quietly, that they'd seen someone taking photos of my house early in the morning. Code enforcement showed up one afternoon, responding to a complaint about unauthorized commercial activity. I walked them through my home office. They apologized and left. Each incident on its own was small, plausibly deniable, easy to explain away as coincidence or misunderstanding. Together they formed something else, a pressure campaign. I started documenting everything, dates, times, language used, which bylaws were cited, who signed what. I didn't confront, I didn't escalate. I observed. Another emergency meeting was announced, then another, always just short of the required notice window, always vague, always centered around community concerns that somehow traced back to me. Neighbors stopped me during walks. Some offered support quietly. Others avoided eye contact altogether. One man pulled me aside and said, "She's never done this to you before, has she?" The way he asked told me the answer. What struck me most wasn't the fines or the meetings. It was the tone, the assumption. Constance wasn't angry. She wasn't frantic. She was methodical. Each step was framed as reasonable, lawful, necessary. That's how power disguises itself when it's being abused. One evening, I received a letter delivered by hand. No envelope, just folded paper placed carefully against my door. It wasn't threatening, it was polite, almost sympathetic. It suggested gently that if I relocated the vehicle out of view or considered alternative storage options, the HOA might be willing to reassess the situation. No admission of wrongdoing, no acknowledgement of the crash, just an offer to make things easier. If I complied, that's when it clicked. This wasn't about winning an argument. She wasn't trying to fine me into submission or prove she was right. She was trying to exhaust me, emotionally, financially, socially. The goal wasn't enforcement. It was removal, make the environment uncomfortable enough that leaving felt like relief. That's how you avoid lawsuits. That's how you keep your hands clean. I sat at my desk that night, violation letters spread out like a paper trail begging to be followed, and felt something settle into place. Not anger, not fear, understanding. That's when I realized she wasn't trying to win. She was trying to make me leave. Something changed after that last letter. Not outside, not in the HOA's behavior. They kept doing exactly what they'd been doing. The notices kept coming. The fines kept accruing on paper. The meetings kept getting called with just enough ambiguity to make them exhausting to challenge. What changed was me. Up until then, I'd been responding, reading, attending, correcting the record, pointing out procedure. It was all defensive, necessary, but reactive. And reactive is exactly where people like Constance want you. tired, on edge, focused on the next hit instead of the pattern behind it. That night, I stopped thinking about what she was doing next and started thinking about what she'd already done. The first thing I did was expand the camera coverage, not just the driveway, every angle that mattered. Front, rear, side yard, street approach, cloud backup with redundant storage, timestamps locked, motion sensitivity calibrated so it wouldn't miss subtle activity. It wasn't paranoia, it was documentatio. If something happened again, I wanted it preserved from multiple perspectives, not just one. Then I organized everything I already had. Every letter from the HOA, every email, every notice, every fine schedule. I scanned the physical ones, saved the originals, and built a digital timeline. Dates on one axis, actions on the other. I included screenshots of bylaws as they existed at the time each notice was issued, not just the current version. Policies have a way of changing quietly when people think no one's paying attention. Next came the records. HOA boards love paper, minutes, votes, approvals. They rely on the fact that most homeowners never ask to see them. I submitted a formal records request, polite, precise, citing the statute that gave me the right to inspect financials, meeting minutes, vendor contracts, and correspondence. The response didn't come right away. When it did, it was incomplete. That too went into the file. While I waited, something unexpected started happening. Neighbors began talking to me, quietly at first, a wave while walking past, a pause at the mailbox that lasted just long enough to say, "Hey, are you doing okay?" One woman stopped me outright and said she was sorry about the car. Not in the casual way people say it when they don't want to get involved. In a way that suggested she understood more than she was saying. Another neighbor knocked on my door one evening, nervous enough that he kept glancing over his shoulder as he spoke. He told me he'd received violation notices years ago for things that were never violations. That he'd paid the fines because fighting felt impossible. That when he finally sold his house, the notice stopped. A pattern. I didn't record these conversations. I didn't push. I listened. I took mental notes. People open up when they don't feel like they're being interrogated. A retired army sergeant named Jasper was more direct. He'd lived in the neighborhood longer than Constance had been in charge. He knew how things used to work, and how they'd changed. He told me flatly that once she decided someone was a problem, the process was always the same. Letters, meetings, pressure, isolation. "She doesn't yell," he said. "She outlasts." That phrase stayed with me. When the HOA finally sent over the records they claimed were complete, I sat down with a highlighter and a cup of coffee and started reading, slowly, line by line, not looking for anything specific at first, just getting familiar with the texture of the paperwork, meeting minutes that summarized discussions without naming dissent, votes recorded as unanimous without roll calls, expenses approved in bulk categories like landscaping and maintenance without itemization. Then I noticed a name that kept repeating, same vendor, different months, same rounded amounts, no variation, no detail, just checks going out regularly, approved without discussion. I pulled the vendor registration. The address matched Constance's. That was the moment my pulse finally changed. Not sped up, slowed down, because that was the shift from conflict to investigation, from opinion to fact, from this feels wrong to this is measurable. I didn't jump to conclusions. I cross-referenced, pulled public business records, looked up licensing, compared billing dates to meeting dates, to vacation photos publicly posted online, to times when the board supposedly approved on-site work that no one remembered seeing. The more I looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't sloppiness, it was comfort born of years without scrutiny. I kept going. I mapped fines against board actions, noticed spikes that coincided with certain homeowners moving out, noticed how enforcement intensity rose and fell depending on who the target was. The data told a story even before the people did. Emails started coming in after word spread that I was looking into things, carefully worded, off the record. Screenshots forwarded with names redacted. Board members who had once voted unanimously suddenly remembered objections that never made it into the minutes. Nobody wanted to be first, but they wanted someone else to be. I made backups of everything, multiple formats, multiple locations, nothing that could be quietly altered or lost. If this ever went further, and by now I knew it would, the integrity of the evidence would matter as much as the evidence itself. Through all of this, the HOA kept pushing. Another fine notice, another meeting announcement, another letter suggesting cooperation would make everything easier. And for the first time it didn't bother me, because I wasn't playing defense anymore. I was tracing supply lines. Power leaves fingerprints. People who abuse it get lazy. They assume no one will ever look closely enough to notice the seams. And that assumption is what eventually undoes them. One eve. Enning. As I sat at my desk scrolling through transaction logs, I stopped and stared at the screen. There it was again. The same vendor, same amount. Billed during a week when no one was even in town. I leaned back and smiled, not out of satisfaction but recognition. That's when I knew. That's when I found something she never expected anyone to look at. And from that point on, it wasn't a question of if this would come apart. It was only a question of how much would unravel once it did. By the time the emergency homeowner meeting was scheduled, the tension in the neighborhood had a weight to it. You could feel it when you stepped outside. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when someone new approached. Garage doors closed a little faster than usual. People were watching, waiting, measuring which side of this they were on without ever saying it out loud. The notice for the meeting went out just after sunset on a Tuesday. Proper notice this time, by the book, requested by homeowners, not the board. That detail mattered. It meant attendance wasn't optional for board members. It meant the room wouldn't be controlled by a single gavel. I spent the day before the meeting organizing, not rehearsing. There's a difference. Rehearsing is about performance. Organizing is about making sure facts don't trip over each other. Every document was labeled, every source cited, public records flagged as such, allegations separated cleanly from proof. I wasn't there to accuse, I was there to present. When I walked into the community center, the room was already half full. Folding chairs set up in tight rows. Neighbors I'd never seen at meetings before sat next to people who hadn't missed one in years. Some avoided eye contact. Others nodded quietly. No one smiled. Constance arrived 10 minutes late. She walked in like she always did, chin lifted, shoulders squared, expression calm. She wore a tailored blazer and carried a leather folder under her arm. At her side was her husband, a step behind, eyes down, and flanking them was a man in an expensive suit who scanned the room before sitting. Legal counsel. She took her seat at the front without acknowledging anyone. Didn't look at me. Didn't need to. She believed she knew how this would go. The meeting was called to order by procedure, not personality. No speeches, no commentary, just the agenda, as required. When it was my turn to speak, the room went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. I stood slowly, not because I needed to, but because it gave me a moment to look around, to see who was there, who wasn't, who had decided to witness this instead of hiding from it. I started with the basics, dates, amounts, vendor names. I explained that I had reviewed HOA financial records obtained through a formal request, that these records showed recurring payments to a single vendor for landscaping services over a 3-year period, that the amounts were consistent, rounded, and approved without itemized invoices. I used words like documented, according to the records, and publicly available filings. I never raised my voice. I never speculated out loud. Then I displayed the business registration. Same address as the HOA president. A murmur moved through the room, subtle but unmistakable. I continued, according to state law, HOA board members have a fiduciary duty to avoid conflicts of interest. Any transaction involving a board member or their immediate family must be disclosed and approved by disinterested parties. The record showed no such disclosures. No recusals, no independent bids. I emphasized one word repeatedly, allegedly, because what I was presenting wasn't a verdict. It was a pattern supported by documents anyone in the room could request themselves. Constance didn't interrupt. She didn't object. She sat very still, hands folded, eyes fixed forward. Her attorney leaned in once, whispered something. She nodded barely. Then came the timeline. Payments issued during weeks when the vendor was allegedly performing on-site services. Weeks when social media posts showed the vendor's owner out of state. Invoices submitted for work that no homeowner remembered seeing. Landscaping improvements billed to common areas that had not changed in years. I paused after that. Let it land. That's when the first homeowner stood up, an older woman, voice shaking but steady enough to carry. She talked about violation notices she'd received for garden decorations that had been there for a decade, about fines that piled up until she sold her home earlier than planned, about how the same vendor had billed the HOA for beautification of her block during that period, even though nothing had been done. She didn't accuse anyone. She just described what happened to her. Then another homeowner stood. Then another. Each testimony was short, no rambling, no exaggeration, just facts, experiences, dates. The common thread was pressure, notices, fines, silence when they asked questions. A former board member spoke next, voice firm, almost relieved. He described emails that never made it into the minutes, votes that were recorded as unanimous despite objections, threats, subtle, implied, that dissent would make life difficult. He had saved the emails. He read one aloud. Constance shifted for the first time. Her attorney stood and objected, citing relevance. The chair acknowledged the objection, then allowed the testimony to continue. The email was entered as part of the record. The room felt different now, not tense, focused, like a courtroom before a verdict, even though no verdict was being delivered. I returned to the podium once more to clarify something important, that no one was being declared guilty, that these were matters appropriate for independent review, that the purpose of the meeting was transparency, not punishment. That phrasing mattered. It kept the ground firm. Then someone near the back spoke up, a man who had barely said a word all evening. He asked a simple question. If all of this is inaccurate, he said, looking directly at the board, why wasn't any of it disclosed? No one answered. Constance finally spoke. She denied wrongdoing, calmly, firmly. She said the vendor was legitimate, that all approvals were lawful, that the timing coincidences were being misinterpreted. Her attorney echoed her statements, reminding the room that allegations were not proof. She was right, and that was the point. Because proof was no longer confined to one person's files. It was now shared, spoken, on record, witnessed. When the motion was made to suspend board authority pending an independent audit, the vote wasn't close. Hands went up across the room. People who had never raised their hands before raised them now. Constance didn't look around this time. She stared straight ahead as the result was announced. After the meeting adjourned, people lingered. Groups formed. Conversations happened openly for the first time in years. I stepped outside for air. That's when the news van pulled up. Someone had tipped them off. Cameras rolled. Questions were asked. Public records were mentioned. Allegations framed carefully. Constance declined to comment as she walked past, her attorney close beside her. She walked in confident. She didn't walk out that way, because confidence relies on silence, and that silence was gone. I stood back and watched as neighbors spoke to reporters, not angrily, not dramatically, but honestly. The story was no longer mine to tell alone. It belonged to everyone who had lived under it. And for the first time since I'd pulled into my driveway and seen my car destroyed, I knew something else had been totaled too. The illusion that this would stay hidden. From here on out, every step would be watched, every record examined, every decision questioned. The dominoes had started falling, and no one, not even Constance, could pretend anymore that it was just about a car. The months after that meeting moved slower than the night it all came apart, but they moved in only one direction, forward. There were audits, independent ones, not run by friends of the board, not summarized in vague language, but conducted line by people whose job was to follow numbers wherever they led. Public records requests turned into subpoenas. Emails that had lived quietly in inboxes were suddenly read aloud in formal rooms. What had once been brushed off as misunderstandings became timelines, transactions, and decisions with names attached to them. Law enforcement didn't rush. They never do. They observed, they verified, they cross-checked what was already there. When they acted, it was methodical, search warrants executed calmly, statements taken without theatrics, no spectacle, just process. The legal outcomes didn't arrive all at once. They never do either. First came the resignations, board members stepping down to focus on personal matters, then formal removals when cooperation wasn't voluntary, assets frozen pending review, charges filed where evidence supported them. Some resolved through plea agreements, others went further. I didn't celebrate any of it, not because I wasn't relieved, but because there was nothing joyful about watching a system fail so many people for so long. Accountability isn't a victory lap, it's a correction. Insurance handled the car. The Lamborghini was officially totaled. The payout came through without dispute. Turns out video evidence has a way of simplifying things. I replaced it months later, quietly, with a newer model, same color, parked in the same driveway. No one said a word. The neighborhood changed, but not overnight. Fear doesn't evaporate just because the source is gone. People needed proof that things were actually different, that fines wouldn't appear without cause, that meetings would be noticed properly, that rules would apply evenly. So the HOA was rebuilt slowly, open books, recorded meetings, rotating leadership, clear conflict of interest policies written in plain language, budgets posted publicly, decisions explained instead of declared. It wasn't revolutionary, it was basic. And that was the point. Jasper was elected president by a margin no one argued with. Vernon became treasurer, insisting on transparency to the point of irritation. The first few meetings ran long, not because of conflict, but because people finally felt safe asking questions. Kids played outside again. Block parties came back. People cooked food that smelled like their homes, not like compliance. New families moved in. Old ones stopped whispering. As for me, the quiet returned in a way I hadn't expected. Not silence exactly, peace. I stopped checking the cameras obsessively. Stopped bracing when I saw an envelope in the mailbox. Stopped feeling like every walk around the block was a test. The house went back to being a place to live, not a place to defend. One afternoon my mom sat on the porch with me, watching neighbors set up tables for a block event. She looked around, smiling, and said, "It feels lighter here." She was right. People sometimes ask me if it was worth it. The stress, the attention, the months of tension. The answer is yes, but not for the reason they expect. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about punishment. It was about refusing to let someone else decide the shape of my life through intimidation. Because that's what this really was. Not a feud, not a grudge, a test of whether power goes unchallenged simply because it's inconvenient to confront. What happened in my neighborhood wasn't unique. That's the uncomfortable truth. It happens quietly, everywhere. In HOAs, in workplaces, in small institutions where the same people hold authority long enough to forget that authority is borrowed, not owned. Most people don't fight back because they're weak. They don't fight back because they're tired, because they're busy, because they don't want to be that person, because they assume the cost will be higher than the outcome. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes, though, all it takes is one person who decides not to move out of the way. I didn't set out to be that person. I just refused to accept the premise that compliance was the only option. I followed the process the same way I'd followed it in my professional life, carefully, patiently, and without theatrics. I let the facts do the talking, and the facts spoke louder than any argument ever could. There's no revenge in that, no gloating, just balance restored. If there's one thing I hope people take from this, it's not that I won. It's that systems only work when someone is willing to look closely enough to see where they break, and brave enough to say something when they do. If you've ever been targeted by someone who thought they were untouchable, you're not alone, and you're not powerless either.